When Delilah Vance woke up that June morning in Asheville, North Carolina, she had no idea it would be the last day she would wake up alone with the crushing weight of a secret she had carried for 6 years. At 38, she had learned to live with guilt as a constant companion, a shadow that followed her into every corner of her small house on the outskirts of town, into every meal she prepared in the kitchen of tech entrepreneur Otis Brenner, and into every glance in the mirror that reflected a woman who believed she didn't deserve a second chance. But fate, or perhaps something greater than she could ever fully comprehend, was about to intertwine her life with that of a man who also carried his own wounds hidden beneath a mask of control and success. What would begin with a strange call and a moment of absolute despair would transform into a journey of pain, redemption, and discovery, proving that sometimes it is precisely when we are at rock bottom, when we think there is no way out, that we find the strength to ask for help and the courage to accept that we don't have to carry our burdens alone. Discover how a chef on the edge of the abyss and a lonely businessman saved each other in ways neither could have imagined, and how the mistakes of the past can become the foundation of a future filled with purpose and hope. The phone vibrated for the 3rd time that chilly June morning, insistent as a warning Otis Brenner couldn't ignore. At 52, he had built his frozen food distribution empire in Asheville on a foundation of impeccable routines and absolute control over every detail. His office on the 2nd floor of the commercial warehouse smelled of crisp paper and strong black coffee, and the stacks of contracts on the mahogany desk reflected years of meticulous work. But that unknown number flashing on his corporate cell phone screen challenged his need for order, stirring something deep in his chest. When he finally answered, irritated by his own hesitation, the silence on the other end disconcerted him. It wasn't an empty silence, but one heavy with something suffocating, a ragged, gasping breath followed by a muffled sob that seemed to tear through the cold morning air. Otis opened his mouth to speak, but the line went dead before a single word escaped. He stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, feeling a strange discomfort crawl up his spine. Something wasn't right. Nothing was right. He looked at the scattered contracts, the fine print blurring before his eyes. His mind, always so focused on numbers and deadlines, now drifted to places he preferred to avoid. Otis was a man who triple-checked every detail before making a decision, who reviewed financial reports even when he knew they were perfect, who double-bolted his front door every night. That call had introduced a variable he couldn't control, and it left him deeply anxious. He decided to head home early, something he rarely did. His residence in an upscale Asheville neighborhood was a silent sanctuary, a modern build with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rolling green hills and distant peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The drive there was familiar, yet that morning every curve seemed to carry an inexplicable tension. The biting mountain wind whipped against the car windows, and the grey sky promised an early-season cold snap. Stepping through the front door, Otis smelled the comforting scent of spices that always filled the house near lunchtime. Delilah Vance, his personal chef for the past 4 months, had a gift for transforming simple ingredients into dishes that brought back childhood memories he didn't even know he possessed. But something was different. The silence weighed heavier than it should, and the aroma of spices seemed tinged with something bitter, almost metallic. He walked toward the kitchen, his footsteps echoing on the light hardwood floors. What he saw when he crossed the threshold paralyzed him completely. Delilah was lying on the cold tile floor, surrounded by pill bottles scattered like the wreckage of a ship. Her hands, those same hands that prepared his meals with such care, were clutching a crumpled letter, her knuckles white from gripping the paper so hard. Her eyes were closed, her face as pale as the frost that covered the mountain meadows in the morning. Otis's heart raced, and for the first time in decades, he felt control slip completely from his grasp. He rushed to her, kneeling on the freezing floor, his hands shaking as he searched for a pulse. It was faint, but there. He shouted for help, grabbed his phone, and dialed 911 with fingers that barely obeyed him. The words came out in a rush, his normally firm and authoritative voice now laden with a panic he didn't recognize. The minutes that followed were a blur of voices, sirens, and rapid movements. Paramedics flooded the house, asking questions Otis could barely answer. He watched it all as if he were outside his own body, seeing a man in a charcoal suit kneeling beside a woman he knew so little about, but who somehow mattered more than he was willing to admit. Delilah was rushed away, and Otis followed in his car, refusing to stay behind. At the hospital, while waiting for news in a waiting room with plastic orange chairs and the smell of industrial disinfectant, he finally looked at the crumpled letter still in his hand. He hadn't realized he'd picked it up off the kitchen floor. His hand shook as he unfolded the paper, and what he read made his stomach churn. They were threatening words, cruel and calculated, written by someone who knew every one of Delilah's emotional wounds and knew exactly how to twist the knife. They spoke of secrets, of shame, of a reputation that would be destroyed if she didn't comply. The signature at the bottom was just an initial, but the tone made it clear that whoever wrote it held power over her, a power born of fear and manipulation. Otis sat down heavily, the letter trembling in his hands. He had always prided himself on maintaining emotional distance from his employees, treating them with respect and fairness, but never crossing the line into intimacy. He paid well, offered great benefits, but never got involved in their personal lives. It was safer that way, cleaner, more controllable. But now, holding that letter and remembering Delilah's fragile body on his kitchen floor, he realized something had shifted. He didn't know what or when, but something inside him had been displaced. When the doctor finally appeared, Otis stood so quickly the plastic chair nearly toppled. Delilah was stable, but needed to stay for observation. She had ingested a concerning amount of medication, but not enough to cause irreversible damage. The doctor spoke about stress, signs of depression, and the importance of emotional support. Otis heard it all, but his mind was already working elsewhere, analyzing the situation as he would a business deal, looking for entry points, vulnerabilities, and solutions. He asked to see her, but the nurses said she needed to rest. So Otis stayed there in the empty waiting room as evening fell over Asheville and the hospital lights created yellowish halos against the darkening sky. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't know exactly what to do. His instinct was to fix, to repair, to control. But this wasn't a poorly drafted contract or a delayed shipment. It was a person's life, complex and fragile, and he wasn't sure if his usual tools were up to the task. When they finally let him into the room, Delilah was awake, but her eyes avoided his. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, enveloped in white sheets too large for her delicate frame. Otis approached slowly, pulling a chair close to the bed. He said nothing for a long moment, just sat there, feeling the weight of the silence between them. It was Delilah who spoke first, her voice raspy and broken. She apologized, said she didn't want to cause trouble, and that she understood if he wanted to let her go. The words tumbled out, laden with a shame so deep that Otis felt a pang in his chest. He interrupted gently, telling her she didn't need to apologize, that the only thing that mattered was that she was okay. But when he asked about the letter, about who was threatening her, Delilah shut down completely. Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face toward the window where the North Carolina night spread out dark and cold. She said only that it was her problem, something she had to handle alone, and that he shouldn't worry. The desperate firmness in her voice made it clear she wouldn't accept help, at least not then. Otis left the hospital with more questions than answers, and the crumpled letter in his pocket felt like lead. The streets of Asheville were deserted that Tuesday night, the biting cold keeping people indoors. He drove slowly, his mind spinning in circles, trying to understand why this affected him so much. Delilah was just his chef, a competent employee who did her job well. It shouldn't matter this much. But it did, and that scared him more than he was willing to admit, because it meant something in his carefully controlled life had slipped beyond his reach, and he had no idea how to pull it back. The following days dragged on with agonizing slowness for Otis. Delilah was discharged after 2 days of observation, but categorically refused his offer to drive her home. She said a friend would pick her up, and when he insisted, she only shook her head with the expression of someone carrying a weight too heavy to share. Otis returned to his routine, but nothing seemed to fit like before. The contracts he reviewed lost their meaning by the third line. The numbers in the financial reports danced before his eyes without forming coherent patterns. For the first time in decades, he began making small mistakes. He forgot to confirm an important meeting, signed a document without checking every clause, and let his coffee grow cold on the desk while staring blankly out the office window. His employees noticed the change, whispering in the hallways, but no one dared ask what was happening to their usually meticulous and controlled boss. The house, once a silent refuge, now felt empty in a way that physically ached. The scent of Delilah's spices still lingered in the kitchen curtains, a ghostly reminder of something that had become important without him realizing it. Otis hired a temporary cook, a woman named Estella, who prepared competent but soulless meals. Every bite tasted like ash, and he could barely finish his plates. On the fourth day, he drove to the outskirts of Asheville, following the address he had discreetly found in the company's employee records. Delilah's house was a simple cottage in a neighborhood where the roads were still paved with old brick and the backyards had well-tended vegetable gardens. The rusted iron gate creaked when he opened it, and the sound made a dog bark somewhere nearby. Before he could knock, the door opened. Delilah stood there, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, her eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like fear. She begged him not to be there, saying it was dangerous for both of them, but Otis didn't budge. He said only that they needed to talk, that he had read the letter and wanted to help. The resistance on her face was palpable, but there was also a profound exhaustion, as if she were too tired to keep fighting alone. She let him in, and the house inside was even more modest than he had imagined. Old but well cared for furniture, handmade lace curtains, and plastic-framed photographs of an older woman who had the same sad eyes as Delilah. The scent of herbal tea filled the air, mixed with the aroma of homemade bread. They sat at the kitchen table, and for long minutes no one said a word. It was Otis who broke the silence, his voice softer than usual. He said he understood if she didn't want his help, but at the very least, he needed to know what he was dealing with. Delilah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and began to speak, her voice trembling but determined. The man threatening her was Regis, her ex-husband, an accountant who worked for a rival company. He had controlled her for years during their marriage, using love first and then fear to keep her trapped. When she finally gathered the courage to leave him 2 years ago, Regis swore he would destroy her life. He said he knew secrets of hers that would ruin any chance of a fresh start, that in a town like Asheville, where circles overlapped and gossip traveled fast, she would be blacklisted from every social circle. Delilah thought that with time he would forget, that he would find someone else to torment, but she was wrong. Regis began showing up at the places where she worked, talking to her bosses, planting seeds of doubt about her honesty. She had lost 3 jobs in a year because of it. Every time she seemed to be rebuilding her life, he appeared like a shadow, always with that calculated smile, always with insinuations that made people look at her with suspicion. When she got the job at Otis's house, she swore to herself that this time would be different. She would keep her distance, do her job perfectly, and give no one a reason to question her character. But Regis found out where she was working. It started with texts, then calls, and finally the letter Otis had found. He threatened to reveal something about her past, something Delilah didn't specify, but which Regis claimed would ensure she never got a decent job in Asheville again. He demanded money, amounts she would never have, and said if she didn't pay he would go to Otis personally and tell him everything. The shame on Delilah's face as she told this was so intense that Otis felt a surge of anger, an emotion he rarely allowed to surface. It wasn't anger at her, but at that man who used someone's past as a weapon, who fed on the fear and vulnerability of another person. He asked exactly what Regis was threatening to reveal, but Delilah shook her head, saying only that it was something she had done when she was desperate, something that wasn't a crime but would be judged harshly by the more conservative circles of local society. Otis wanted to push, but he saw in her eyes that forcing the revelation would be like repeating the violence Regis inflicted. So he changed strategy. He offered legal help, said he knew good lawyers who could get a restraining order, who could sue Regis for extortion. But Delilah refused vehemently, her hands shaking on the table. She said she didn't deserve kindness, that Otis should just leave her to handle it alone, that she wasn't worthy of his concern. Those words hit Otis unexpectedly. Here was a woman who cooked with such care, who arrived early every day, who left kind notes reminding him to take his vitamins, saying she didn't deserve kindness. The dissonance between the person he knew and the image she had of herself was so great he couldn't process it. For the first time, Otis understood that Delilah's problem wasn't just Regis, but something much deeper, a wound in her soul that had been bleeding for years. He left her house without having achieved much, only a reluctant promise that she would return to work the following week. But something had changed in that meeting. Otis was no longer just a boss concerned about an employee. He had become someone who had witnessed another person's raw pain and couldn't simply move on. In the following days, he began to investigate discreetly. He used his contacts in the Asheville business community to find out more about Regis. What he found disturbed him deeply. Regis Tavares was 45 and worked as a senior accountant at Andrade Foods, one of Otis's competitors in the food distribution business. He was known for being meticulous and ambitious, but there were also rumors about his explosive temper and his tendency to hold grudges. A common supplier, during a seemingly casual conversation at a business lunch, mentioned that Regis was having financial troubles. There were rumors of gambling, of mounting debts, of increasing pressure at the company where he worked. Otis absorbed every bit of information like pieces of a puzzle, his analytical mind working to find patterns and vulnerabilities. When Delilah returned to work, she was different. Quieter, if that were even possible, moving through the kitchen like a ghost. She prepared meals with the same competence, but the lightness that once permeated her movements had vanished. Otis tried to start conversations, but she responded in monosyllables, always keeping her eyes down, always finding excuses to pull away. Winter in the Blue Ridge deepened, and the mornings became increasingly frigid. Frost covered the fields in a white mantle that shimmered under the weak sun, and the biting mountain wind seemed to penetrate to the bone. It was the kind of cold that reminded people of their own fragility, the kind that made the elderly close their windows early and children run inside before dusk. On one of those particularly cold July mornings, an unusual mountain chill, Otis arrived in the kitchen earlier than usual and found Delilah preparing a strong herbal tea, a ritual she performed with the reverence of someone conducting a sacred ceremony. The scent of the herbs filled the air, mixed with the aroma of fresh biscuits baking in the oven. She started when she saw him, nearly dropping the hot kettle. He asked to join her, and after hesitating, Delilah prepared a cup for him. They sat in silence, sharing the quiet space, the ritual creating a silent bridge between two people who barely knew each other but were somehow connected by circumstances neither had chosen. It was during that moment of stillness that Delilah began to talk, not about Regis or his threats, but about her childhood in the mountains. She told him about her mother, who had worked her whole life as a seamstress, about the harsh winters when they barely had money for firewood, about how she had learned to cook out of necessity but discovered a passion that sustained her in her darkest moments. She spoke about local festivals, the mountain traditions that the community gathered to celebrate, passing them down through generations. Otis listened to everything, realizing this was more than just a conversation. It was Delilah allowing him to see beyond the competent employee, beyond the tormented woman, revealing pieces of who she truly was. And in the process, he realized he was sharing too, talking about his own loneliness, about how he had built a successful company but lost human connections along the way, about adult children who only called when they needed something, about an ex-wife who had left him because, according to her, he loved control more than people. The following weeks brought a subtle but perceptible change. Kitchen conversations became more frequent, deeper. Delilah began preparing traditional Southern Appalachian dishes, recipes she had learned from her mother that carried memories of simpler times. Cornbread, slow-cooked greens, savory stews, each dish a story, each flavor a connection to roots Otis had forgotten he possessed. But Regis's shadow was never far. In August, Delilah arrived at work with a pale face and trembling hands. Regis had shown up at her door the night before, drunk and furious, shouting threats that the neighbors surely heard. He hadn't done anything beyond shouting, but the message was clear. Time was running out, and if she didn't pay what he demanded, the consequences would be devastating. Otis felt the anger return, more intense this time. He couldn't just stand by while that man terrorized her. But she begged him not to do anything, saying any intervention would only make things worse, that Regis was unpredictable and dangerous when challenged. Otis's frustration was palpable, his need to control the situation clashing with the impossibility of protecting someone who refused to be protected. Then something happened that would change everything. During a business lunch in early September, Otis found himself sitting next to Maurice Andrade, the owner of Andrade Foods, where Regis worked. The conversation was casual, about suppliers and market prices, until Maurice mentioned he was having trouble with his finance department. There were discrepancies in the reports, nothing big enough to trigger immediate alarms, but enough to make him uncomfortable. Otis listened with renewed attention, his mind working quickly. He asked casually who was responsible for those accounts, and Maurice mentioned Regis, among other names. He said he trusted him, he'd been with the company for years, but that recently he seemed distracted, irritable, no longer the exemplary employee he used to be. Otis absorbed every word, and when the lunch ended, he had information that could change everything. But using that information would mean crossing a line. It would mean investigating a man, possibly ruining his career, all based on suspicions and coincidences. Otis had always prided himself on his business ethics, on playing fair, even when it meant losing an advantage. But now, thinking of Delilah and the terror in her eyes when she spoke of Regis, he wondered if his principles were worth more than protecting someone who desperately needed help. The question tormented him as night fell over Asheville, the winter chill seeping through the closed windows of his empty house. And he knew that soon he would have to make a decision that would define not only Delilah's fate, but also who he truly was when his deepest convictions were tested. The decision came to Otis on a sleepless night in September, when the clock struck 3 a.m. and the biting mountain wind made the house creak. He was sitting in the dark living room, only the moonlight illuminating the contours of the furniture, when he realized he couldn't just stand still. His principles were important, but there was something even more important: the life of a person who had trusted him, even reluctantly, even without saying it in words. In the following days, Otis began his investigation with the discretion of someone who had always operated behind the scenes of the business world. He talked to suppliers, asked seemingly innocent questions during casual meetings, and requested public financial reports of companies in the sector. Every small piece of information was like a puzzle piece that slowly formed a disturbing image. Regis Tavares was embezzling money from Andrade Foods. They weren't huge amounts, but enough to fuel what appeared to be a sports betting addiction. Otis discovered through an accountant friend that Regis frequented online betting sites, had debts with local bookies, and was living far beyond what his salary allowed. The discrepancies Maurice Andrade had mentioned weren't accounting errors. They were carefully calculated movements to hide systematic theft, but the most disturbing discovery was that Regis was preparing a scapegoat. There were altered documents, manipulated records, all pointing to other employees in the finance department as responsible for the missing money. It was an elaborate plan, the kind of thing someone with deep accounting knowledge could architect, and it would likely work if no one investigated thoroughly. Otis kept every piece of evidence meticulously, knowing he had to be careful. He couldn't just hand everything to Morris without raising suspicion about how he had obtained the information. But now he had something concrete, something he could use as leverage to get Regis out of Delilah's life permanently. The problem was that using that information meant becoming exactly the kind of person he had always despised. Someone who used privileged information to manipulate situations to his advantage. The internal struggle consumed Otis. During the meals Delilah prepared, he observed her discreetly, noticing how she startled at every unexpected sound, how her hands shook when the phone rang, how she carried an invisible weight that bowed her shoulders. She was a woman of only 38, but she seemed to carry decades of suffering in every weary movement. On a particularly tense afternoon in late September, Delilah arrived at work, later than usual. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she moved through the kitchen as if every step required a monumental effort. Otis couldn't stay quiet any longer. He asked directly what had happened, and this time Delilah broke down. Between sobs that seemed to tear her throat, she told him that Regis had increased his demands. He wanted $10,000 by the end of the month. Otherwise, he would go to Otis and reveal her secret. Delilah didn't even have a tenth of that amount. She had spent all her savings just trying to keep him away in recent months. She was cornered with no way out, and the only solution she saw was to give up everything, leave Asheville, and start over somewhere else where no one knew her. But even that solution seemed impossible. Regis had connections in other towns in the region. He would find a way to hunt her down, to destroy any attempt at rebuilding her life. Delilah was trapped in a web of fear and shame from which she couldn't escape, and with every passing day, that web tightened around her neck, suffocating any hope of freedom. It was at that moment, seeing the woman who prepared his meals with such care fall apart before him, that Otis made his final decision. He could no longer weigh abstract principles against the concrete suffering of someone who desperately needed help. He told Delilah she wouldn't have to worry about Regis anymore, that he would take care of it, but she panicked. She begged him not to do anything, saying Regis was dangerous when he felt threatened, that any confrontation would only make things worse. Otis held her trembling hands, looking directly into her frightened eyes. He promised he would be careful, that he wouldn't put anyone in danger, but that she needed to trust him. Delilah wanted to refuse, her mouth opening to protest, but something in Otis's firm gaze made her hesitate. For the first time in years, she saw someone willing to fight for her, not out of pity or obligation, but because he genuinely cared. Otis's investigation intensified. He discreetly hired a forensic accountant, someone from outside Asheville who had no connections to the local business circle. He presented the evidence he had collected and asked for a professional analysis. The report he received a week later confirmed everything. Regis had been diverting money for at least 18 months and had created a complex scheme to blame other innocent employees when the fraud was discovered. Armed with that information, Otis did something he never imagined doing. He set up a meeting with Regis, saying only that they needed to talk about a delicate business matter. He chose a cafe in downtown Asheville, a public place where Regis couldn't make a scene without drawing unwanted attention. The meeting took place on a chilly morning in early October. The cafe was moderately full, the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the aroma of pastries straight from the oven. Regis arrived punctually, a man of medium height with calculating eyes and a smile that didn't reach his pupils. He wore a well-tailored suit that probably cost more than it should, considering his official salary. They sat at a corner table, far enough from other customers for privacy, but close enough not to look suspicious. Regis ordered an espresso and leaned back in his chair with a confidence bordering on arrogance, clearly curious about what this successful businessman wanted with him. Otis went straight to the point. He placed a thin folder on the table and pushed it toward Regis. He said only that it contained information Maurice Andrade would find very interesting. The confidence on Regis's face faltered for a second, but he regained his composure quickly, taking the folder with fingers that tried not to shake. As Regis flipped through the documents, Otis watched the color drain from his face. There was all the evidence. Inconsistent bank statements, altered documents with handwriting analysis showing recent modifications, online betting records linked to his name, and recorded conversations with bookies. It was damning and complete, the kind of thing that wouldn't just end his career, but potentially put him behind bars. Regis closed the folder with hands that were now visibly shaking. His voice, when he finally spoke, had lost all its previous arrogance. He asked what Otis wanted, how much it would cost for that information to disappear, but Otis shook his head, his voice firm but not aggressive. He said he didn't want money, he only wanted Regis to leave Delilah alone, completely and permanently. The negotiation that followed was tense and lasted nearly 3 hours. Regis tried to bargain, tried to downplay his actions, even tried to threaten Otis, but every attempt hit the cold reality of the evidence that now existed against him. Finally, as the cafe began to empty for the lunch hour, Regis agreed. Otis had prepared a document, drafted by a lawyer he trusted, where Regis committed to never contacting Delilah again, directly or indirectly, under penalty of having all that evidence delivered not only to his employer, but also to the proper authorities. Regis signed with trembling fingers, his signature a desperate scrawl on the paper. But before letting Regis go, Otis did something that surprised them both. He offered help, for him to seek treatment for his gambling addiction, saying he knew competent and discreet professionals who could assist him. He didn't do it out of kindness toward Regis, but because he understood that desperate people did desperate things, and he wanted to ensure Regis wouldn't return to terrorize Delilah when his financial situation inevitably worsened. Regis refused with a sharp nod, took his briefcase, and left the cafe without looking back, his shoulders slumped under the weight of defeat. Otis sat there for a few more minutes, looking at the signed document, feeling a mix of relief and discomfort. He had done what needed to be done, but the method left a bitter taste in his mouth. When he returned home and told Delilah what he had done, her reaction was different from what he expected. She didn't show immediate relief or effusive gratitude. Instead, she collapsed into tears, deep sobs that seemed to come from a place far beyond the present moment. They were tears of years of fear, of accumulated shame, of a weight that could finally be set down. Otis stood there, awkward but present, while Delilah cried. He didn't try to console her with empty words or impossible promises. He just stayed, his silent presence a testimony that she was no longer alone in that battle. When the tears finally dried, Delilah looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude and something deeper, something neither was ready to name. But the peace that moment promised would be fleeting. Because 3 days later, on an October morning that began with frost and the promise of sun, Delilah finally revealed the secret Regis had used as a weapon against her. And what Otis heard would completely change his understanding not only of Delilah, but of the nature of guilt, forgiveness, and what it truly means to deserve a second chance. The revelation came during a quiet morning, when the sun finally broke through the heavy clouds that had covered Asheville for days. Delilah was preparing breakfast, her movements lighter since Regis had signed the agreement, when she suddenly stopped mid-gesture, her bread knife suspended in mid-air. She turned to Otis, who was reading the paper at the table, and said in a voice that seemed to come from very far away that she needed to tell him something, that he deserved to know the truth before he continued helping her. Otis lowered the paper slowly, noticing the tension in her body. Delilah sat at the table, her hands interlaced so tightly her knuckles turned white. She started by talking about her mother, Mrs. Carmela, a seamstress who had worked her whole life in precarious conditions, sewing school uniforms and simple clothes for local families. When Delilah was 32, 6 years ago, her mother began feeling sharp stomach pains she ignored, saying it was just gastritis from too much coffee and worry. But the pains worsened, and when they finally got an appointment through the state's healthcare assistants after months of waiting, the diagnosis was devastating: advanced stomach cancer. The doctor said there were treatments, there was hope, but they had to move fast. The problem was that the public treatment had a waiting list months long, and Mrs. Carmela didn't have months to wait. Delilah, still married to Regis at the time, begged him to help pay for private treatment. But Regis refused. He said it wasn't his responsibility to take care of his mother-in-law, that they already had enough debt, and that Mrs. Carmela should have taken better care of herself when she was younger. The coldness in his words cut Delilah deeper than any previous argument, and it was at that moment she realized her marriage was a prison, not a refuge. Desperate and alone, Delilah made a decision that would haunt her for the next 6 years. At the time, she was working as a volunteer treasurer for the community center in their neighborhood, a non-profit that ran a daycare for working families. She had access to the center's accounts, knew every cent coming in and going out, and knew there was an emergency fund of $15,000 that had been sitting idle for months, earmarked for future daycare renovations. One night, alone in the small office of the center with the memory of her mother's pain echoing in her mind, Delilah transferred $12,000 from that account into her own. She told herself it was just a loan, that she would pay it all back in a few months, and that her mother needed that money to live. She used the money to pay for the first months of private treatment, and for a brief moment it seemed she had made the right choice. Mrs. Carmela responded well to the initial treatment, and there was real hope for remission. But the cancer was too aggressive, and even with the private care, Mrs. Carmela passed away 3 months later. Delilah was destroyed, not just by the loss of her mother, but by the crushing guilt of what she had done. In the 6 months that followed, she worked tirelessly at 2 jobs, sleeping only 4 hours a night, eating 1 meal a day, saving every penny until she could return the full $12,000 to the community center's account. No one ever noticed. The record showed only a movement and then a replenishment, and since Delilah was the treasurer, she managed to adjust the books so that temporary hole never appeared in the reports. She returned everything down to the last cent, but the guilt remained, eating at her from the inside like a slow acid. She resigned as treasurer shortly after, saying she needed time to mourn her mother, and no one questioned it. She divorced Regis a few months later, unable to continue living with a man who had made her feel so alone in her hardest moment. She thought she could start over, that she could leave it behind and build a new life on the ruins of the old. But Regis, always meticulous and spiteful, had kept documents from the period they were married. He found old bank statements and center records Delilah thought she had destroyed, and he connected the dots. He realized what she had done and saw it as the perfect weapon to control her. It didn't matter that she had returned everything. It didn't matter that no one had been harmed in the end. In a tight-knit mountain town, where reputation was everything and gossip traveled faster than facts, the story of a woman who had taken money from a daycare, even temporarily, would be enough to destroy any chance of a normal life. When Delilah finished telling the story, the silence in the kitchen was so thick it felt physical. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, unable to look at Otis, waiting for the judgment she was certain would come. She expected to see disappointment in his eyes, or worse, that coldness she had seen so many times when people discovered secrets about others. But when she finally gathered the courage to look up, what she saw on Otis's face wasn't judgment. It was understanding, mixed with a profound sadness. He said nothing for a long moment, then reached his hand across the table and covered her interlaced hands with his own, the warmth of the touch saying more than words could express. Finally, Otis spoke, his voice raspy with emotion. He said he understood the desperation of trying to save someone you loved, that he understood the guilt that comes from making impossible choices in impossible situations. He shared something he had never told anyone. Years ago, when his company was starting out and he had 2 young daughters to feed, he too had taken questionable shortcuts, made deals that bordered on illegal, and put personal interest above principles he would later defend vehemently. It wasn't the same situation as Delilah's, but it came from the same place of desperation, the same primal instinct to protect those who depended on him. The difference was that he had been lucky. His risky bets had paid off, and no one ever found out. But that didn't make him better than Delilah, just more fortunate. And the true difference between them was that Delilah had carried that guilt like a cross, while he had buried his so deep he had almost managed to forget it existed. Otis's words seemed to break something inside Delilah. She began to cry again, but these tears were different. They weren't tears of despair or fear, but of relief, of finally being able to set down a weight she had carried alone for 6 years. For the first time since she had taken that money, someone looked at her and saw not a monster, but a desperate daughter who had made a terrible choice in terrible circumstances. The following days brought a palpable change in the house's atmosphere. Delilah seemed lighter, her movements in the kitchen gaining a grace Otis had never seen before. The meals she prepared tasted different, as if the act of cooking had transformed from an obligation into a celebration. They talked more, sharing life stories, discovering unexpected connections in seemingly different experiences. Otis started coming home earlier, making excuses to himself about efficiency and the need for work-life balance. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. He liked being there. He liked the kitchen conversations while Delilah prepared dinner. He liked learning about the mountain traditions she shared with such affection. And he liked being seen not as the successful entrepreneur or the demanding boss, but just as Otis, a 52-year-old man rediscovering what it meant to genuinely connect with another person. October moved into November, and spring, or rather the crisp autumn peak, began to paint the Blue Ridge in vibrant hues. The trees that would soon be bare were currently a riot of red, orange, and gold. It was a context of renewed hope. But the next twist arrived quick and brutal as a summer storm. Otis was in his office reviewing contracts when he felt a sharp pain in his chest. So intense it doubled him over the desk. Initially, he thought it was just indigestion from eating too quickly during a business lunch. But the pain didn't pass. Instead, it intensified, radiating down his left arm and up his neck. His assistant found him like that, pale and breaking out in a cold sweat, and immediately called an ambulance. At the hospital, after a battery of urgent tests, the diagnosis came as a blow that left Otis stunned. He had a serious heart condition, likely developed over years of unmanaged stress, poor sleep, and a diet that favored convenience over nutrition. He needed urgent surgery to place stents in blocked arteries, and after that, radical and permanent lifestyle changes. The irony wasn't lost on Otis. Here he was, the man who had controlled every aspect of his life with surgical precision, discovering his own body, had rebelled against that excessive control. The doctor spoke about risk factors, the importance of stress management, diet and exercise, but Otis barely heard him. His mind was fixed on one terrible realization. He was vulnerable, truly vulnerable, for the first time in decades. Surgery was scheduled for the following week, and the days of waiting were the longest of Otis's life. He called his children, Madison and Ryan, both adults living in other cities. Madison, who lived in Charlotte working as an attorney, said she would try to come but had a major case going to trial. Ryan, an engineer in Raleigh, was more direct. He said his father had always been strong, that he'd overcome this, like he'd overcome everything else, and that there was no need to be dramatic. He also called his ex-wife Beatrice, who had been living in Atlanta for 5 years. The conversation was brief and cold. She expressed polite concern, but made it clear their lives had diverged long ago, and he shouldn't expect her to drop everything to care for him. She said she'd already dedicated too many years trying to be the support he never seemed to need or value. For the first time in his adult life, Otis saw himself as truly alone. He had built a business empire and accumulated considerable wealth, but when he looked around for people who would care if he didn't wake up from surgery, the circle was terrifyingly small. And it was exactly at that moment of extreme vulnerability, when fear and loneliness threatened to crush him, that Delilah appeared at his hospital room door, carrying a thermos of homemade soup and a quiet determination in her eyes that he would never forget. Delilah entered the hospital room with hesitant steps, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to be there. She carried a thermal lunchbox and a canvas bag with what looked like clean clothes. Otis, lying in the narrow hospital bed with tubes in his arm and monitors beeping softly in the background, felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. She approached slowly, setting the thermal box on the bedside table. She said softly that she had prepared a special soup with ingredients to help heart recovery, following recipes her mother used when someone in the family was sick. It was made with fresh vegetables, medicinal herbs from a neighbor's garden, and a bone broth that had simmered for hours. The scent was comforting, bringing back memories of care and attention Otis hadn't experienced in decades. He tried to thank her, but his voice broke. Delilah sat in the chair beside the bed, and for a moment, neither said a word. It was she who broke the silence, saying he had done so much for her, saved her from a torment that seemed endless, and now it was her turn to give back. She said she would stay with him through the surgery and recovery, taking care of him just as he had cared for her. Otis protested weakly, saying she had no obligation, that she was already doing more than her job required. But Delilah shook her head firmly. It wasn't about obligation or work, she said. It was about two people who had somehow become important to each other, about recognizing that sometimes saving someone means allowing yourself to be saved too. The surgery took place on a misty November morning. Otis was taken to the OR at 6:01 a.m., and the last thing he saw before the anesthesia took hold was Delilah's face through the door window, her hands pressed against the glass in a silent gesture of encouragement. During the 4 hours the surgery lasted, Delilah stayed in the waiting room, alternating between pacing and sitting with her hands interlaced, whispering the prayers her mother had taught her. When the doctor finally appeared with news, Delilah stood so quickly she felt dizzy. The surgery had been successful, they said, but recovery would be long and require significant changes. Otis would need complete rest for at least 2 weeks, followed by months of limited physical activity and a strictly controlled diet. He would need someone to help with basic tasks for the first few weeks, someone to monitor his meals and ensure he followed medical advice. Delilah took on that responsibility without hesitation. In the following days, she completely transformed the routine of Otis's house. She researched heart-healthy diets extensively, talked to nutritionists, and learned about foods that aided heart health and those to avoid. She prepared meals that were not only nutritious, but flavorful, using spices and herbs to compensate for the lack of salt, creating dishes that made Otis forget he was on a restrictive diet, but her care went beyond food. Delilah was there in the most vulnerable moments, when the post-op pain became too intense, when the fear of his own mortality kept Otis awake in the middle of the night, and when the frustration of depending on someone else for simple tasks threatened his dignity. She never judged, never showed impatience. She was simply there, a constant and comforting presence. In the long afternoons of recovery, sitting on the house's porch while the late autumn sun gently warmed the air, they talked about things they had never shared before. Otis spoke about his failed marriage, how he had prioritized work over family, and the regret of missing important moments in his children's lives because he was always in meetings or traveling. He spoke about the void he felt, even at the height of his success, how he had everything but felt like he had nothing truly important. Delilah, in turn, shared memories of her mother, how Mrs. Carmela managed to find beauty and purpose, even in the hardest circumstances. She spoke about what she had learned during those years of torment with Regis, how fear can make us small, but finding the courage to ask for help can be the bravest act of all. She shared her favorite recipes, each with a story, each dish a connection to roots she had never abandoned. Days turned into weeks, and something subtle but profound was changing between them. It was no longer a relationship of boss and employee, or even just close friends. It was something neither had a name for, a connection that went beyond conventional categories, built on shared vulnerability and mutual care. Follow-up medical appointments showed consistent progress. Otis's heart was recovering well, and the doctor was impressed with the improvement in his cholesterol and blood pressure. He credited the strict diet and stress management, not knowing the true medicine was having someone who genuinely cared, someone whose presence transformed the house from an empty space into a real home. But it wasn't just Otis who was changing. Delilah was transforming too. The woman who had arrived at that house 4 months ago, bowed under the weight of shame and fear, now walked with her head held high. There were still moments of insecurity, still nights when old guilt haunted her, but she was learning something fundamental, that making a mistake didn't define her, that her capacity to love and care was worth more than any past imperfection. In December, when Otis finally received full clearance from the doctor to resume normal activities, they celebrated with a special dinner. Delilah prepared a banquet adapted to his dietary restrictions, each dish a work of culinary art that demonstrated not just technical skill, but genuine love. Sitting at the table with candles lit and the soft summer light shifting to a cozy winter evening feel entering through the windows, Otis realized he was about to make the most important decision of his life. He started by talking about the company, how nearly losing his life had made him rethink his priorities. He said he wanted to do something different, something that brought real meaning instead of just profit. And then, taking Delilah's hands over the table, he presented a proposal that left her speechless. He wanted to create a new company, a small operation focused on healthy meal prep for people with dietary restrictions, especially those recovering from heart issues. They would use the recipes Delilah had developed during his recovery, those perfect combinations of nutrition and flavor that proved healthy food didn't have to be bland. And he wanted Delilah to be his partner, not just a hired cook, but an equal partner in the business. Delilah froze, her mouth opening and closing without being able to form words. She said she didn't have money to invest, no business experience, and that she didn't deserve such an opportunity. But Otis interrupted gently. The financial investment would come from him, he said, but the culinary expertise, the passion, the soul of the business would come from her. As for deserving it, he had spent the last 2 months seeing exactly what she deserved, a chance to turn her talent into something that helped others, an opportunity to build something of her own over the ashes of the past. Delilah hesitated for days. The fear of not being good enough, of disappointing Otis, of failing publicly. It was almost paralyzing, but there was also something new budding inside her. Hope. For the first time in years, she could imagine a future that wasn't defined by her worst mistake, a future where she wasn't just the woman who had taken money and almost destroyed everything, but someone who could build, create, and contribute. In the weeks that followed, they worked together, developing a business plan. Otis brought his business experience, his network, and his understanding of logistics and finance. Delilah contributed her culinary creativity, her deep knowledge of ingredients and techniques, and her ability to transform restrictions into creative opportunities. It was a partnership where each other's strengths perfectly complemented the other. They found a small commercial space in the East Asheville area, modest but with potential. They began testing recipes, developing a menu that balanced flavor and specific nutritional needs. Delilah discovered she had a natural talent for adapting traditional Southern mountain dishes into healthier versions, keeping the essence of the flavors while reducing sodium, saturated fat, and sugar. In January, when the winter was in full swing and Asheville bustled with visitors coming to enjoy the mountain scenery, they finally opened Savor and Soul, their small meal prep company. The name had been Delilah's idea, simple but direct, communicating exactly what they offered. The grand opening was modest, just a few friends and acquaintances, but there was an energy in the air that promised something special. The first days were chaotic. Mistakes happened, deliveries were delayed, and some recipes needed adjustment. But there were also successes. A customer recovering from a heart attack wrote an emotional testimonial about how the meals had helped him stick to his restrictive diet without feeling deprived. A local nutritionist began recommending the service to her patients. Word of mouth began to spread. But it was on a Tuesday afternoon in February, when the winter chill made the kitchen work almost unbearable, that the final revelation arrived. Delilah was organizing orders when her phone rang. It was an old acquaintance from the community center days, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The woman was calling to congratulate her on the new business. She'd seen an article in the local paper about Savor and Soul, but then the conversation took an unexpected turn. The woman mentioned casually that she remembered that terrible day in June, 6 years ago, when Delilah had called her crying, desperate, saying she didn't know what to do anymore. Delilah was confused. She didn't remember making that call. The woman continued, saying Delilah was so distraught she could barely speak, only sobbed into the phone, and that she had tried to call back several times, but the phone was off. At that moment, like a bolt of lightning through a dark sky, Delilah understood. The strange call Otis had received that June morning, the call that had brought him home early, that had led him to find her unconscious on the kitchen floor, wasn't from some random unknown number. It was from her. In her moment of deepest despair, right as she was about to take those pills, when she felt there was no way out, she had dialed Otis's number without realizing it. Her subconscious reaching out for help even when her conscious mind had already given up. When the call ended, Delilah sat in silence, phone still in hand, processing the revelation. Everything made sense now, the perfect timing, the way Otis appeared exactly when she needed him most, the inexplicable connection she had felt with him since that day. It wasn't coincidence or mysterious fate. It was her, in her most vulnerable moment, reaching for the one person her heart knew could help her, even if her mind wasn't aware of the choice. She found Otis in the administrative area of the small company, reviewing the next day's orders. She told him about the call, the revelation, and how everything had started at that moment of total despair when she had, without knowing it, asked him for help. Otis listened in silence, and when she finished, he smiled, that rare smile that completely transformed his usually serious face. He said it didn't matter if the call had been intentional or not. What mattered was that she had the courage to trust him, even subconsciously, and that he'd had the luck to be there when she needed it. But more importantly, he said, was recognizing that he had needed her as much as she had needed him. She had saved him, not just by cooking healthy meals during his recovery, but by showing him what truly mattered in life, genuine human connection and building something with purpose beyond profit. The company grew slowly but consistently over the next few months. They didn't become rich overnight, and there were moments of financial difficulty that made them question if they could keep going. There were nights when Delilah got home too late, too exhausted to eat, only to wake up too early to start again. There were times when Otis had to use part of his personal savings to cover operating costs, when the return on investment seemed always just over the horizon. But there were also victories. Small ones at first, a regular customer bringing a friend, a positive review on social media, a corporate order from a local business. And then bigger victories, a contract with a hospital to provide meals for heart patients, a partnership with a rehab-focused gym, and recognition from the Asheville Nutritionist Association as a recommended provider. Each victory had a cost. Each success required sacrifice. Delilah gave up free weekends, hobbies she once loved, and time for herself. Otis drastically scaled back his operations at the frozen food distribution company, delegating more responsibility and accepting less profit in exchange for more time dedicated to the new venture. But neither regretted it, because they were finally building something that mattered, something with meaning beyond the bottom line. And on the rare nights when they managed to stop, when they sat in the small back room of the company after everyone had left, sharing a cup of herbal tea and talking about the day's challenges, they both knew they had found something rare and precious. As the clock struck midnight and the city of Asheville slept silently under the mountain stars, they understood that saving someone and being saved were just two sides of the same coin. Redemption didn't come from forgetting past mistakes, but from using those scars as a foundation to build something beautiful and lasting. Autumn returned to Asheville, bringing that characteristic Blue Ridge crispness, and with it, transformations neither could have predicted a year ago. Savor and Soul had completed 8 months of operation, and what had started as a modest dream now employed 6 people, besides Otis and Delilah. The small commercial kitchen they rented at the start could no longer handle the growing demand, and they were negotiating the purchase of a larger space in the city's industrial district. But success also brought unexpected challenges. One March morning, Otis received a call from Maurice Andrade. The entrepreneur's voice sounded tense, and he asked for an urgent meeting. When they met that afternoon, Maurice went straight to the point. Regis Tavares had been arrested the previous week. The accounting irregularities Otis had discovered months ago had finally come to light through an internal audit. Regis hadn't just embezzled money. He had created a complex fraud scheme that harmed several innocent employees. During interrogation, Regis had mentioned Otis's name, suggesting he had inside information about the company and hinting at some kind of conspiracy. Maurice wanted to understand the connection between them, why Regis would mention Otis specifically. It was a delicate situation, and Otis knew he had to be careful with his words. He told part of the truth, that Regis had been married to an employee of his, that there were personal issues involved, and that he had learned about the accounting irregularities through casual conversations with common suppliers. He omitted the details about the threats to Delilah, the deal they had made, and how he had used that information as leverage. Maurice seemed satisfied with the explanation, thanked him for the previous, even if indirect, information, and said Regis would likely face criminal charges. When Otis told Delilah about the meeting, she turned pale. She asked if Regis had mentioned her name, if his threats would finally come true, even from behind bars. Otis held her trembling hands and said no, that Morris hadn't mentioned her at all, that Regis was likely too desperate trying to save his own skin to follow through on old threats. But the news brought back anxieties Delilah thought she had overcome. Over the next few nights, she barely slept, constantly returning to that old fear that her secret would be revealed and everything they'd built would crumble. Otis noticed the change. The way she jumped at every sound, how she checked her phone compulsively for bad news. It was on one of those sleepless nights, when Delilah was in the company kitchen at 3 a.m. prepping dough because she couldn't stay still, that Otis made a decision. He arrived at the kitchen still in his pajamas, having driven there when he realized she wasn't home, and said they needed to talk. They sat in the same back room, but this time the weight in the air was different. Otis started by saying he had thought a lot about Delilah's secret, the mistake she had made years ago and the power it still held over her. And he had realized something fundamental. The secret only had power because she allowed it to. He proposed something radical, that she reveal what had happened herself. Not to the whole city, not in a dramatic public confession, but to the people who mattered. To the current board of the community center, to explain what had happened, show the records of how she'd paid back every cent, and ask for forgiveness, not because she legally had to, but because she morally deserved to. Delilah was terrified by the idea. She said she would be destroyed, that no one would understand, and everything they'd built would be ruined. But Otis argued patiently that the opposite was true. As long as it remained a secret, Regis or anyone else would have power over her. But if she told the story herself, on her own terms, with full context and truth, it would stop being a weapon and become just a part of her story, a mistake from which she had learned and grown. It took weeks of conversations, back and forth, with Delilah nearly agreeing, and then pulling back in fear. But finally, on a sunny April afternoon, she requested a meeting with the current president of the community center, a woman named Teresa, who had taken the position 3 years prior. They met at the center's headquarters, in the same small office where Delilah had once been treasurer. The scent of crayons and paper drifted from the daycare next door, and children played in the yard, filling the air with innocent laughter. Delilah told everything, her voice trembling but firm, starting with her mother's diagnosis and ending with the full repayment of the money and her voluntary resignation. She showed old bank documents she had kept all those years as proof of her guilt and her restitution. She apologized, not because she legally needed to, as she had already paid it back, but because she felt she owed it morally. She said she understood if they wanted to make it public, that she would accept any consequence, but that she finally needed to set that weight down. Teresa listened in silence, her eyes misty. When Delilah finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she said something Delilah never expected, that she had known Mrs. Carmela, that she remembered Delilah's desperation back then, and that she understood the impossible choices desperation forces upon us. She said the fact that Delilah had returned everything, carried that guilt for so many years, and now had the courage to confess even without being forced, spoke more about her character than the original mistake. The center wouldn't make it public, Teresa said. There was no benefit in destroying the reputation of someone who had already paid her debt in every possible way. But there was something she wanted to propose, that Delilah consider making regular donations to the daycare now that her business was prospering. Not as restitution, that was already resolved, but as a way to give back to the community, transforming that painful experience into something constructive. Delilah left that meeting feeling lighter than she had in years. The secret that had imprisoned her for so long had lost its power, not because it was forgotten or forgiven in an empty way, but because it had been confronted honestly and transformed into something positive. In the following weeks, she established a monthly donation to the daycare, and more than that, she began volunteering a few hours a week, teaching basic cooking and nutrition to the mothers in the community. Meanwhile, Savor and Soul kept growing, but not without challenges. In May, a major supplier drastically increased the prices of the organic vegetables they used, forcing them to choose between cutting profit margins or raising prices for customers. They chose to keep the prices and absorb the cost, even if it meant months of working with almost no profit. There was also the challenge of managing growth while maintaining quality. Hiring and training new staff was harder than they had imagined, and there were mistakes, wrong orders, customer complaints. Each problem seemed to test their resolve, making them wonder if they could really make it work long-term. It was during one of those moments of doubt in June, exactly 1 year after that fateful morning when everything began, that something unexpected happened. Madison, Otis's daughter, showed up unannounced at the company. She had moved back to the area, taking a position at a law firm in Asheville, and wanted to talk to her father about something important. They sat at a nearby cafe, and Madison was direct. She said she was ashamed of how she had reacted when he had his heart trouble, how she hadn't been there when he needed her. She said she'd spent the last year rethinking her priorities, realizing she was repeating her father's mistakes, prioritizing her career over relationships, accumulating professional successes, but feeling empty personally. She wanted to try to rebuild a relationship with him, for real this time. Not just superficial calls and obligatory holiday visits. She wanted to get to know this new side of him, understand what motivated him now, and learn from the changes he'd made. Otis moved, accepted, but he was also honest. He said it wouldn't be easy, that he was still learning to be different and would make mistakes, but that he valued the opportunity to try. Madison began visiting regularly, gradually getting to know Delilah and the Savor and Soul team. She was impressed with the operation, the passion she saw in everyone there, and the real difference they were making in people's lives. During one of those visits, she mentioned casually that she knew an investor in Charlotte who was looking for social impact businesses to support, and asked if they would be interested in pitching the project. Otis and Delilah hesitated. Rapid growth through outside investment could completely change the nature of the business, potentially taking away the control they valued so much. But it could also allow them to help many more people, expand to other cities, and make healthy meals accessible to a larger population. After long discussions, they decided to at least hear the proposal. The meeting took place in July, and the investor, a man named Albert Harrison, who had built a fortune in tech and now focused on social ventures, was genuinely impressed. Not just by the numbers, which were solid, but by the story behind the company, the authenticity of the mission, and the way every employee spoke passionately about the work. Albert offered investment to open 3 new units in nearby cities, while keeping Otis and Delilah in majority control with the final say on strategic direction. The deal also included management mentoring and access to a network that could open doors that would take them years to reach on their own. It was a tempting offer, but also a scary one. It meant responsibility for more employees, more customers, and more operational complexity. It meant less time in the kitchen for Delilah and less direct involvement for Otis, but it also meant multiplying their impact, helping more people and creating more jobs in a region that desperately needed them. They decided to accept, but with clear conditions. Growth would be gradual, 1 unit at a time, ensuring quality and mission weren't compromised by expansion. Every new manager would be personally trained by Delilah, absorbing not just cooking techniques, but the philosophy behind the work. And they would always maintain the connection with the local community through regular donations and nutritional education programs. The first expansion happened in September in Boone, a neighboring mountain town known for its university and cold climate. The process was harder than they had imagined, full of logistical and cultural challenges, but gradually the new unit began to establish itself. When they finally saw a customer in Boone, an elderly woman recovering from a stroke, cry with gratitude because she could finally eat flavorful food that didn't compromise her health, they knew they had made the right decision. In October, a year and a half after that June morning that changed everything, Otis and Delilah found themselves again on his porch, now transformed into a space where they frequently held informal planning meetings. The autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold, and the air had that crispness that heralded the coming winter. Delilah commented almost casually on how it all started with that strange call, that moment of despair when she didn't even know she was asking for help. She said she sometimes thought about how different their lives would be if he hadn't answered that phone, hadn't gone home early that day, and hadn't decided to care about an employee he barely knew. Otis was quiet for a moment, then said something he had realized only recently, that perhaps she wasn't the only one who had made that call. In a way, his heart had also been asking for help back then, calling for something missing in his life, for connection and purpose beyond control and material success. She had saved him as much as he had saved her, showing him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that accepting help didn't diminish his strength, and that building something meaningful with another person was infinitely more valuable than accumulating solitary achievements. Delilah smiled, that genuine smile that completely transformed her face, so different from the scared, bowed woman she had been 18 months ago. She said her mother used to say that the best things in life came from the hardest moments, that it was precisely when we thought we couldn't go on that we discovered what we were truly made of. At the time, young and protected, she hadn't understood. But now, having walked through the darkest valley and emerged on the other side, not just whole but stronger, she finally understood. In the following months, life continued with its characteristic rhythm of challenges and victories. Ryan, Otis's son, also began to reconnect, initially with skepticism, but gradually with genuine respect for what his father was building. The second and third expansions happened, each with its own unique difficulties, but also its own success stories. There were still hard moments. In December, a major supplier went out of business suddenly, forcing them to find replacements in a hurry. In January, a winter storm delayed deliveries for weeks, testing their crisis management. In February, a competitor with more resources tried to copy them, offering similar products at lower prices, forcing them to trust the quality and reputation they had built. But every challenge was faced together. Otis, with his business experience and analytical capacity, Delilah with her creativity and deep understanding of the heart of the business, and around them, a team that wasn't just employees, but people who believed in the mission and saw their work as more than just a job. In March, 2 years after that June morning, Savor & Soul received an award from the North Carolina Department of Health for significant contribution to public health through proper nutrition. The ceremony took place in Raleigh, and Delilah was invited to give a speech. She was terrified by the idea, but Otis encouraged her, saying her story needed to be told, that it could inspire others struggling with their own demons. On stage, before hundreds of health professionals and entrepreneurs, Delilah told her story. Not every detail, but enough. About losing her mother, about making desperate decisions in impossible moments, about living for years under the weight of shame and fear, and about finding salvation not through forgetting, but through honestly confronting the past and transforming it into something constructive. She spoke about how a call in a moment of total despair had changed everything, about how accepting help from someone willing to see beyond past mistakes made it possible to rebuild a life. And she spoke about how she'd discovered that redemption doesn't come from erasing the past, but from using those scars as a foundation to build something beautiful, transforming pain into compassion and mistakes into wisdom. When she finished, the silence in the room lasted only a second before exploding into applause. People stood up, and Delilah saw tears on many faces, recognizing reflections of their own struggles in them. After the ceremony, dozens of people approached her to thank her for her honesty, to share their own stories of error and redemption, and to say they had been inspired. Otis, noticing her contemplative quietness, asked what she was thinking. Delilah smiled in the dark of the car and said she was thinking of her mother, how proud she would be, not just of the business or the award, but to see her daughter finally free of the weight that had bowed her for so long, finally able to walk with her head held high, finally understanding that being worthy of love and respect didn't mean never making mistakes, but rather having the courage to face them, learn from them, and use that learning to become better. And as the lights of Asheville began to appear on the horizon, marking the end of that trip and the beginning of another day of hard but meaningful work, they both understood they had discovered something rare and precious. That sometimes saving someone means allowing yourself to be saved too. That real strength comes from accepted vulnerability, and that the best stories aren't those without difficulties, but those where difficulties are transformed into springboards for something greater, more beautiful, more human, proving that even on the coldest June mornings, even in moments of greatest despair, there is always the possibility of a call that changes everything, of a hand reaching out to pull us off the ground, and of a tomorrow that, though it never erases the past, can build upon it a future where mistakes turn into wisdom, pain into compassion, and loneliness into a deep and lasting connection that makes every struggle worth it.